Greetings. As we come now to the 25th Sunday or weekend of the year, this year in which we are observing what's known as the B year, the year dedicated, particularly remember, to the Gospel according to Mark. And so the section that we're listening to Mark this time is from chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. The first two readings, the first comes from the book of Wisdom, chapter 2, verses 12, and then verses 17 through 20. And the New Testament reading from the letter of James is chapter 3, verses 16 through chapter 4, verse 3. So those are the scriptural readings. Well, as we've been noticing as we go along here, we're following really the whole sequence of Mark's story. And so this week, as we come to chapter 9, one notices that last week we ended in chapter 8. So let's pick up a little bit. This will not again be material that you will hear Sunday, but to get the continuity of Mark's presentation of Jesus. In verse 36, which backs us up to where we have been, that is in chapter 8, verse 36. I mention that because this time we have a 36 in chapter 9 also. For what does it profit a person to gain the whole world and to suffer the loss of their soul? So Jesus, you remember, had challenged that it be important to carry the cross. And in verses 37, 38, Jesus says, whoever is ashamed of me, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him. So it kind of finishes out that little discussion that Jesus had begun with his disciples, remembering that it had been the result of giving the first of three predictions as to what was going to happen to Jesus when he arrived in the city of Jerusalem. We come now to chapter 9, verses 1 through 13, deal with the transfiguration of Jesus, namely a story that when one goes back remembers was the particular scripture reading for the second Sunday of Lent. In our Catholic tradition, that second Sunday in Lent is always given over to the Transfiguration. We have noticed on other occasions that actually the Feast of the Transfiguration of Jesus in the church is on August 6th, so there are a number of times throughout the year in which that particular story or event is remembered, so it's not remembered this time since it has already been done earlier. Then at verses 14 through 29, picture a large crowd, and the scribes are included in this, and they bring to him a man who is afflicted with a mute spirit. Now, mute spirit here is a contemporary word for meaning an evil spirit. And the boy is attacked. He is dashed to the ground. He foams. He grinds his teeth. He becomes very rigid. This story is similar to the story of the Gerasene, had appeared in chapter 5, verses 1 through 20 of Mark's story. So it's an episode that he has presented once before. Today we would look at the characteristics of this attack of the young boy, as it had been of the young man, or the older man, had been what we would today call epilepsy. It fits all the categories that we know, but remembering in the ancient world they didn't have the kind of medical information that we have. And when things like this, which were extraordinary actions on the part of a person, were considered to be the work of an evil spirit. And so Jesus is pictured again here as a healer. In fact, when they bring the boy before Jesus, he is asked, will you cure him if you can? Now, that, of course, is pictured a little bit in Mark as a challenge. He's asking if Jesus can do something, and he says that all things are possible. This would be in the text for one who believes. Well, the man who has brought his son before Jesus says, interesting words, I believe, but help my unbelief. Now, there might be a whole kind of way of understanding that phrase, because the man believes that Jesus has this power and authority from God, but also because things are not going the way that he had hoped, realizes that his belief is not as firm and as solid as it might be. Now, that's an important line as it moves through the Markan story, because the disciples are often pictured as believing, and yet their belief is a little bit as if there were unbelief. So, although the phrase here is original, the idea is not, is a characteristic further of the Markan tradition. A reminder, perhaps, that belief, firmness of belief, is a process or a way by which we grow. It may not be as firm and as solid as we would like it to be, or as sometimes it is thought to be. All right? So Jesus then is pictured here as healing the man. And there is then this little aside that afterwards the disciples of Jesus say to him, why could we not, when this man brought his boy before me, why could we not heal him? Now, this, of course, might be a Markan question rather than one that was immediately addressed to Jesus. After all, by the time that we read the Gospel of Mark, remember, written at least 30 years or so after Jesus' time, the community of believers had thought that the power that Jesus had received had been passed on to the community. So could it be that as this episode was being taught and remembered, that they were thinking, why could the community not bring healing to others? And the response here is, well, this can only be brought about by prayer. So the thought was that the power to heal was still available to the Christian community through the grace that Jesus had and God had given to the community. But there was also a thought that the divine power at this point, that is, the time in which Mark's story has been written, had gone into an eclipse. And so therefore the only thing they could do in terms of healing was to resort to prayer. Well, all of that is kind of a reflection on why or how to answer the question that is posed, why could we not do this healing for this man? All right, that brings us now to the episode that we're looking at this time, which begins in verse 30, as we mentioned. And it is pictured that this particular episode now, Jesus is saying, moving through the Galilee, but this marks the end of Jesus' public ministry in the Galilee, that is, in Mark's story. And he says he did not want anyone to know why he was saying this. Why didn't he want people to know what he was doing or where he was going? Well, The usual interpretation, and of course these are always intriguing statements that Jesus is pictured as saying, is that Jesus, from this point on, as the journey to Jerusalem takes place, wants to devote his time and energy to instructing the circle of disciples. So as Mark sees it, his public teaching to a large group of people, although we'll see that isn't exactly the case, but seems to be the point that is being made by that statement and by the wish of Jesus. He wants to bring his disciples to a fuller understanding of who he is and how God's work is entering. All right. We now get the second prediction of what we call the Passion. We've noted this, that there would be three. This is the second. By the way, this is the simplest of all the developed Passion predictions. It is also the shortest of the three, and it works kind of with a prophecy model. Has three little quick statements. One, that the Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of enemies. Second, his death will occur at their hands. And third, he will rise. So, that would be, now, when they Jesus rather gives this prediction, why do the disciples not question what Jesus is saying? You remember that the first time prophecy had been given, Peter had kind of stepped up and had questioned this. Here the disciples say nothing. Now, either they are not more enlightened as they have moved along, and so therefore that's why they say something, or they might be gun-shy, as we might say. They have heard this prediction. They have remembered a little bit what had happened to Peter when he had kind of questioned this, and so therefore they're not going to say anything and get into any kind of difficulty with Jesus on this account. So that's another kind of interpretation that is given at this point. Now, they are pictured as entering into Capernaum. As you remember, Capernaum, of course, was and this is in the Galilee, so there is teaching still happening here, was with the headquarters in a certain way of Jesus, and the whole question of the house, which we looked at earlier on, I think, in our discussions here. But there is a house there. Some say that it was the house that belonged to Peter, because remember that earlier on in this story, Jesus had healed the mother-in-law of Peter and therefore had gone into his house. Others assume, although we are not quite sure, that Jesus himself had a house in Capernaum. And so that therefore when they enter the house, it wasn't Peter's, but it was Jesus. Anyway, all of that, again, a little bit of background as to the whole question of the house. And Jesus now asks the disciples, now that they are at home, if you want, what were you talking about as we were on the road? See, so they were moving along, and they are a little, well, shall we say, embarrassed or quiet. Interesting, because what they had been discussing as they had been moving along, asking the question, who is the greater or the greatest in the kingdom? Now, so one gets a sense of what they thought the messianic role of Jesus would be, that there would be well, what do we want to say? Seats of honor, positions of honor. Remember how always this question of honor is part of the value system of the Mediterranean world, and certainly Mark, as all the writers were familiar with. So was that what they were considering? Who was, kind of the more important and would have the greater position? Well, the response to that is, remember that Jesus takes a child, places him in the midst, and says, if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be last of all and the servants of all. So again, these are remarkable words, certainly words that we have heard and that will be reflected on as we go along. Now, Jesus brings into his midst a child. All right, so now certain questions emerge. Who is this child? Where did this child come from? And interpreters of the passage have various kind of explanations. One say that it was a child who was playing nearby, and so that somehow Jesus just had him brought in, or her. We're not even sure here of the sex of the child. Notice it's simply mentioned a child. Or some say it might have been Peter's son or daughter. See, so because after all, if they were near Peter's house in Capernaum, well, maybe that's who the person was. And St. Ignatius of Antioch, a writer later on, thought that it was someone who was a God-born one. Interesting. Now, Ignatius' thought develops in the 9th century, so this is a later, obviously, interpreter or reflection on this. And therefore, that reason is Jesus embraces the child in a symbolic way, okay? All right, take your choice there, who this child is, who remains nameless, and we don't know anything further about it. Now, the idea that Jesus pictures brings in a child. There is also the Aramaic word, which is translated child, could also be, for those of you, it would be spelled in English, Talya, could also be translated as servant. So child and servant. And we do know that the understanding of child in this first century world is not the one that we tend to have. It's not so much that the child is innocent and unspoiled, and that there is a great deal of sentiment toward child. We are very, we have all these beautiful kind of soft, if you want, images of child. Not the case in the first century world. A child was indeed treated as a servant, and servant is a nice word for slave. So therefore, in this world, the child lacked social status and lacked legal rights. In effect, a child was considered to be a non-purpose person. So all of that might be important to keep in mind as this little episode unfolds. Children were not the first to be considered in certain events. I come across the writing of St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, who was a later church thinker, but had this analogy. He said, in a raging fire, a husband is obligated first to save his father, then his mother, next his wife, and then least of all, a young child. So you see, it's not as we might think today, run in and save the child. No. And if that were the case and the fire were really raging, the possibility of the child surviving might not be as strong as we might have thought. And also the thinking was that if a famine should strike the land, now this was thinking throughout the Middle Ages, and certainly in the Mediterranean world time, children were fed last. Now, keep in mind that we today would say if there were famine and people were hungry, we would feed the children first, right? So notice there is a different attitude toward children that had developed. The Mediterranean disciple fuses love with violence. So we only do this to those whom we love and care for. So although certainly children, now keep in mind that children were important to protect and to guard. Why? Because children from that point of view, were what we would call social security. What did parents do when they got older? Who would take care of them? So the more children you had, the better chance you had that they might take care of you and make sure that your needs were assisted to or attended to. Now I smile because we have seen this episode about the relationship of children to parents earlier on. In fact, as we have mentioned on a number of occasions, that the commandment that said, honor your father and your mother, had been aimed at children of, well, we would call middle age, okay? Not little children that we're talking about here, but rather those who were in the full strength of their power and ability were to be taken care of their parents, who were not maybe as able now to take care of themselves as earlier on they had been. So in that sense, you can see the importance of children. But in terms, as we mentioned, of their social status, and if you had a lot of children, well, maybe you just nurtured a couple of them. In fact, the firstborn son in a relationship had a very close relationship to the mother. We notice that too with those who have studied this. The strongest relationship of the firstborn son was to mom. So if there was an emotional bond that existed, that would have been it. So all of this is to say, when Jesus now uses the child, so I go into all of this because keep in mind that what he was saying to his, well, at this point to the disciples, was difficult. That's not the way they had been raised to think. That wasn't the way in which society thought about things. And so now the statement of Jesus, if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all. So to be like, well, a slave or to be like a child was, blink your eyes, was challenging at that time. So that's the episode that we are looking at this time as we come to the let me just back up a moment. I had another thought about the relationship of children. In the book of Proverbs and in Sirach, which are two kind of Old Testament or books that are found in our collection, the writer exhorts fathers to punish sons physically. Father doesn't want to suffer neglect in later life for not strengthening and punishing his, particularly sons, in a physical way. Now, can you imagine today how that would work if parents were doing something like that? The government would come in, we have child protection law and all of that. But it's interesting that that was not the thinking I'm suggesting here. After all, the book of Proverbs and Sirach were written about 200 years prior to Jesus' time, but certainly that way of thinking would have been prevalent. And The idea of using physical punishment fit the saying, and sometimes you even hear people say that today, we only do this because we love them. Sure, we only kind of inflict physical punishment because we love you. All right, well, maybe that be the case. I did want to back up to that because I thought it was a kind of interesting reminder of really how different attitudes are in the 21st century than they were, not only in the first century, but as we noticed, throughout much of the Middle Ages. So it's a whole issue about children and the relationship to parents and how they ought to be treated generally in society. Certainly there is a radicalness in Jesus' teaching, by the way, that he did think, and that's found in another section of Mark's Gospel, that children were entitled to the same rights and respect as adults. And from that point of view, that being the understanding of Jesus' teaching would have been rather revolutionary and challenging for first century time. The first reading comes from the book of Wisdom, again, a book written maybe about 150 years or so prior to Jesus' time. In the section that we hear this time, borrows images from the book of the prophet Isaiah, which we have noticed before is divided into three sections, but the section that he uses is chapters 52 through 66, but particularly uses here the fourth servant song. We have commented on this song on other occasions, but it illustrates here in the section that we hear how the just one will be treated. And the question is, will the servant of God remain faithful? And will God come to rescue him? So I think that's the reason why this particular section is related. You really have to see how there's a kind of little stretching sometimes of relatedness here. But the ungodly speak of how they will conspire to assault the righteous one who has become a living reproach to them. So again, you get this. So there were three things, according to the wisdom tradition and the ancient world, that plagued those people. First, an honorable person stands in opposition to the wrongdoings of the wicked. So they don't like someone who does this because it caused attention to be focused on them. Second, the honorable person denounces them for their sin. And then thirdly, he accuses them of not being faithful to their upbringing. So with that in mind, one perhaps can see that the image here of the servant that wisdom comments on is not liked, because he does those kind of things to, well, who is he speaking to? Again, the question of who the servant speaks to has different interpretations. It could be to a small group, could be to a leadership group, or it could be to the larger community in general. And in that sense, then the servant exercises what we would say a prophetic role, speaks the words of God, speaks the actions that Israel or the group that he is addressing should be following and are not. So as I mentioned, this is chosen, the first part, today's gospel, in which Jesus reports that he is the servant of God, and then that his destiny is depicted, as we've mentioned earlier on in our discussion, with the second prediction of his death. Notice that in Jesus' predictions, the idea of crucifixion is not mentioned. So he says he will be handed over to the hands of men, put to death, but does not say how. And that's kind of interesting as how that will be developed, because certainly the idea of crucifixion has a much deeper and stronger emphasis as this story of Jesus continues. Well, once again, thank you for being with us, and may we truly, again, try to take to heart that we are the children of God and are to be servants, carers with and for one another. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.